My name is Sue Sisley. I practice internal medicine and psychiatry, so I'm mostly doing primary care for seriously mentally ill patients. And I'm based out of Scottsdale, Arizona, and most of our work is at the Phoenix Biomedical Campus. So in terms of efficacy of marijuana in treating PTSD, we have numerous anecdotal reports from our combat vets and even from other first responders like police and fire talking about how valuable cannabis has been in managing their symptoms. So nobody's arguing that marijuana is a cure for PTSD. We're simply submitting that it appears to have really good efficacy in helping with symptom control. And really, when you think about most psych meds, psychiatric meds are not a cure either, right? So when I put somebody on Zoloft or any of the SSRIs, they're getting some efficacy as long as the drug is administered, but as soon as they stop it, they revert back to their baseline. So, and that's the same thing with marijuana. Marijuana is a pretty short-acting drug, so the expectation from the scientific community is that they would have to dose the drug pretty regularly in order to continue managing their symptoms. But what we find from patients is a lot of them learn how to use it more in a targeted way to manage. For instance, a lot of our PTSD patients have flashbacks at night and real trouble sleeping, and so they can simply dose marijuana in the evenings to help them decompress so that they can get some rest at night, which normally they couldn't do. And what's really the beauty of marijuana for treating PTSD is such a complex syndrome. It has so many, it's not just flashbacks and nightmares, it's also depression and anxiety and increased startle response and all kinds of this whole array of symptoms that are not easily managed by one or two medications. So usually people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder end up on 5 or 6 different psychiatric meds, and then they're plagued with all kinds of side effects and drug interactions. Whereas marijuana, being such a complex plant with 60 or 70 different phytocannabinoids, the way they all interact makes marijuana effective enough that it can be I'm sorry again. It's like curious.
So the phytocannabinoids, as they interact in like an entourage,
yes,
and with our own
endocannabinoids, right. So the way marijuana with its 60 or 70 different phytocannabinoids and this entourage effect, the way they all interact so elegantly with each other, the truth is that marijuana can treat the whole spectrum of PTSD symptoms with this one medication instead of having to prescribe 5-6 different medicines to target each of those different symptoms that PTSD patients suffer from. So it's a really fascinating plant in the way it can manage so many different, we hear Don Abrams talk about that a lot, how when he's prescribing a chemotherapy that these patients have they're riddled with side effects from chemo, and yet and normally he'd have to prescribe 5 different medicines to treat their anorexia and their depression and their sleep problems, and yet with one drug suddenly we can manage all of those things in a much more concise way. And so I think the bottom line is the proof is in the clinical response. We're seeing patients who are able to walk away from a lot of their psych meds and their opioids and simply manage their symptoms with one drug, marijuana, and that speaks volumes about the medical, despite what the government says about marijuana having no medical value. You can't deny all these anecdotal reports from numerous veterans, and not just your run-of-the-mill veterans. I mean, a lot of these are high-ranking veterans who hold a lot of respect and prestige in the military complex, and they're speaking, they're showing the courage more and more to speak openly about their experiences with marijuana. And I think that's been the most valuable thing in trying to move this issue forward and, you know, help educate the public about why this is so important. Marijuana is the only Schedule I drug that requires a second approval by NIDA even after you've already received FDA approval and IRB approval from a university. You still have to get this second review by NIDA. So in our frustration with trying to overcome this NIDA monopoly and in our inability to implement any of our marijuana studies that we're trying to move forward, we decided to create this PAC called Americans for Scientific Freedom, and I think that's a very appropriate name because we are desperate to ensure that science is never trumped by politics. We believe that, you know, rigorous scientific studies deserve to be implemented and should never be shackled by the political environment that we're in. And so our PAC's mission is just squarely focused on eliminating all barriers to marijuana research. And we've been really surprised and heartened by the groundswell of public support that's come forward to help move this PAC along and enable the PAC to really start building relationships with elected officials that we'd never had in the past. You know, we just kept sharing our story and feeling like eventually it'll make some headway, that eventually we got, you know, a really rational argument here about the importance of and the need for data, and yet we don't seem to be moving the needle at all. And so we realized that until we started, you know, making targeted contributions to select elected officials, that we started to open the doors to, you know, and suddenly we have access to people who are in high levels of decision making, both at the federal level and at the state level. And I think that's really going to enable us to finally have some meaningful discussions with people who have the power to change this environment in favor of science and ensure that important studies that desperately need to happen will finally get implemented.